I'm ready to start with the nursery block. I'm thinking that for this block the pieces are quite a bit bigger than in the two previous blocks, a little bit easier to applicate to. So I'm thinking that for this block I'm going to use the fusible interfacing method. And so for that I will be working with design that's printed right side, on the right side. And then I'm going to trace, maybe not all of the pieces. There are pieces like the sun in the picture that I'll probably just use fusible web for. And for that I will reverse the image. But for these, remember that fusible interfacing, it has like a soft side and then the glue on the back side, it's kind of rough. So I will be tracing this onto the soft side. And I am going to do most of the pieces in the crib and the picture frame, except for the sun. I guess those are the only pieces that I'm not going to use this method for. So if you want to do the same, go ahead and trace all of your pieces onto the fusible interfacing, and remember not to cut them out yet on the line. We're going to cut out each piece individually, but leaving quite a large seam allowance around each. So I'm going to go ahead and trace all my pieces, and then I will come back to show you how I prepare them for appliquing. So I've prepared all my interfacing pieces, and what we're going to do here is, on this piece, this is the glue side, and we're going to put that right sides together with the right side of the fabric. And this is piece number 6 on your pattern, and if you look at the pattern you will see that this part here is going to be tucked under another piece. So we don't really need to sew this part here. But all of this will be exposed. Well, up here won't either, so you don't really need to sew that either. But so we are going to sew along from down here all around to here. And then we'll leave this part open for turning. It's also probably best if you use an applique foot so you can see the line. And the other thing I would suggest is that if you are using a fabric marker, or if you're a marker, you best use a fabric marker, because this will be left inside and you don't want this to bleed onto your fabric, this line. And so either use a permanent marker that you know will not bleed, or a fabric marker that will come out with in the wash and won't stain your fabric. The other thing too is I suggest that you sew along the outside of the line, because if you do it on the inside of your traced line, your piece might be too narrow or too small by the time you turn all the piece inside out and the seams are turned under. So it's best if you sew along the outside of your traced line. And using an applique foot really helps you see where you're going. Okay, so this up here is not necessary, but since it's such a short distance, I'm going to go ahead and sew through, so I don't need to break thread. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim the seam, and I'm going to trim it to a little over 1/8 of an inch. I've trimmed my seam, and now I'm ready to turn my piece inside out. So something else that I should mention on pieces that have curves or places like this, it's really best to clip, just being careful not to cut through the thread. Okay? And then on a piece like this, remember this is going to be tucked under, so I haven't sewn this closed. However, it is kind of narrow to pull everything through, so I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a slit here in the wider part so that I can turn the piece inside out. Here, now just pull the interfacing away from the fabric so that oops, I'm on the wrong side, that's why. So that I don't cut the fabric. So just a little clip that will help me turning my piece inside out. And what I want to make sure is to be very, very careful when I go along the edges so that I don't tear the interfacing, because I'm working with very thin fusible interfacing. So just very, very gently poke the edges through. And basically what we're accomplishing with this technique is to turn the edges, or the seam allowance, under our piece. It takes a little bit of fussing, but it's totally worth it. Okay, so once we've turned this inside out, then you'll notice that the fusible part, the glue part, is on the outside now, which means that we can go and put this on our background fabric and then just press it, and that will keep it in place while we applique the edges down. This is the edge that is going to be under another piece. Okay, and because of the glue, we can't really press this, so all you can do right now is kind of finger press it. Okay, and this is ready to be appliqued. Now let's look at some of the other pieces. This technique is actually great for large pieces. Okay, this one goes here. On pieces like this one, move this up, for the picture frame, this is a really good example of a really good piece. The only thing that you have to watch here is to kind of trim the corners, okay, and to once again not cut through the thread. And on a piece like this, you can actually make a pretty big hole, which makes it really easy to turn inside out. And that's what I like about this technique, especially for large pieces, easy shapes. This is really a great technique for those, for that type of piece. Okay. Okay, and then just, once again, just be careful with those corners, okay? On this piece of the picture frame, what I've done is I have first joined the two pieces of fabric, and you will notice that I traced the line onto my interface. So once again, this is the glue side, and I will align that along the seam. I've pressed the seam open. I will align that along the seam before I sew the interfacing down. And then I will once again sew the entire 4 sides down before I make my slit in the back and turn it inside out. That way I don't have to applique this piece. It's already joined and I can simply applique one piece. The other thing that I forgot to mention, and as much as possible I do like to match the thread to the piece that I am basting, but it's not absolutely necessary because the edges are going to be turned out, but just in case anything ever peeks through, you might want to consider doing that. Okay. On pieces like this one, these are places where you just need to make sure that you clip the curve. And once again, these are really easy pieces to work with this technique. I think it's a great technique for these large, easy pieces. Not so good for small, intricate pieces, but pieces like these here that are going to be tucked under. So there's only one edge that is turned under, like this one. This works really well too. All you have to do is sew along the upper edge and then just turn it around. And so that makes this one really easy to do too, even though it's a small kind of piece. So these 2 pieces that go here, it's the same thing, this one goes here. Just make sure that you leave enough fabric at the bottom because it will be tucked under other pieces. So this piece will go on top of this one, and then this one will be tucked under this one here. So just make sure that you leave enough room in those, okay? On pieces like the heart, I haven't turned this one inside out. This is actually a small piece, but it's still very doable, okay? And what you want to do is just make sure that you clip right here and that you clip the point, but also once again without cutting through the thread. And then this is a small one, so you will have to jiggle a little bit. I would make the slip like this. And just be very, very careful when you're turning it inside out that you don't tear that interfacing when you're pushing the fabric through. This technique is not really that great for certain pieces, like really, really tiny pieces. So in the case of these 2 here, I would rather work with fusible web. And so I will use that there. The same for the sun with all these points. That would be kind of a nightmare to try to do that with fusible web, with a fusible interfacing. And the same thing when it comes to circles. I have found that even with large circles, they tend to turn out kind of wonky when you use fusible interfacing. So this also, for circles, I would prefer to just use some fusible web, and that's what I'm going to do in those cases. For these, even though these are also small pieces, since they're very easy shapes, this method actually does work pretty well. And so I will be using, I have prepared these with the fusible interfacing, and I will be using them there. Okay. Then the other piece that is kind of a challenge, and I figured I was able to prepare it, is this one down here. But the only way to turn this around was by slitting the interfacing almost up to the point and basically just turning the point under. Now, that means that when it comes to applying this, I'm going to have to be very, very, very careful to first iron down the one side before I can tuck the other side in. And I don't know if it's really worth that much work. So this is a piece that I think I would recommend that you use the fusible web instead of interfacing, or any other method that you choose. But since I already prepared it, I'm going to go for it and see how it turns out. Okay. The other thing that I haven't mentioned is that we have one piece here that does not need to be turned under. It lies under all 4 edges, or 3 edges, I guess in this case, since it's a triangle, lie under other pieces. So in this case, what I've done is I've just cut my piece a little bit larger all around so it will fit under all these pieces. And I'll just use a little bit of fabric glue to hold it in place while I applique the other pieces onto the background of fabric. So that's the next step. Let's go and start sewing. I'm now ready to start stitching. In the bobbin thread, I'm using a light blue thread to match my background fabric, and in the top I am using the invisible thread again. The difference with this one is where in the previous blocks we used a buttonhole stitch or blanket stitch for we're using with fusible web. In this case, I'm going to use a different stitch on my sewing machine. It's called an applique stitch, a quilter's applique stitch, where basically what it does, it takes 3 small stitches, 1, 2, 3, 2 small, and just one little bite into the applique fabric. Okay? So it's a really tiny, it just catches the edge of the fabric. This would not be convenient using fusible web precisely because it catches such a small bite. Okay? But for this technique, since the seam allowance has been turned under, this works really well. So we're going to go around the edge of this piece. And if you can hear it when it goes to the left, you can hear it going through the fabric. So just take your time again. And the kind of interesting thing about this method is that the stitch is so tiny that you can, and using the invisible thread, you can pretty much, I mean, really make an invisible stitch here. You can barely notice that it's there. So a lot of people think that this is a needle turn when it's actually appliqued by machine. There we go. So I'll continue to applique the rest of the pieces in the same way, following the order given in the pattern. A little pause here. You'll notice this looks a little bit different than when I started. And that is because the last thing I told you was to follow the numbering on the pattern, which I did not do. So do as I say, not as I do. So what that entailed was I had to lift this up, this part up, on both sides so I could slip these 2 pieces in and applique it. Not a big problem, but just a little bit of a pain. So watch the numbering. Here's my finished block. And so I'd like to go over some of the lessons learned with this block. Do you remember that I have used the fusible interfacing method? So one of the things that I discovered is For example, this heart shape is pretty small, and so I had cut it out using fusible interfacing, but by the time I turned it inside out, I had like some really uneven edges. So I ended up scrapping that and just using fusible wet for this. I also discovered that in pieces like this with very straight edges and straight corners, it's very, very difficult to get that sharp edge. So I had never tried this before with this kind of a piece, and so I've learned. I probably won't use that fusible interfacing again because, see, the edges turned out kind of rounded. However, for curves, large pieces with curves, this method works really, really well. Pieces like this and the curtain here. And even this one, I had to fiddle around with it a little bit, but once I got it in, it actually turned out really well. All in all, this was an easier block to make than the previous two, and I hope that some of these tips are useful for you. Thank you for watching.